Good day, everyone. We are the red and yellow group. Our assigned or learning plan title is Creating the World of Quadratics of the Mathematics 9 first grading period. We have five number of days from Monday to Friday starting 7:30 to 9 a.m. The context standards will be that learner demonstrates understanding of key concept of quadratic equation, inequalities, and functions, and rational algebraic equation. And then our performance standards will be the learner is able to investigate thoroughly mathematical relationship in various situations, formulate real life problems involving quadratic equations, inequalities, and functions, and rational algebraic equations, and solve them using a variety of strategies. So now let's start with Monday.
Day and time, Monday 7:30 a.m. to 9 a.m. Learning competency illustrates quadratic equation. The learning task first is contextualization. Build a rectangular box when one side must be twice the length of the other side. Discussion. Listen and understand the following topics. A. Standard form and identifying the values of A, B, and C in a standard form. B. The use of quadratic formula. Independent practice. Practice A. Set me to my standard. Write each a quadratic equation in standard form. Assessment. Quadratic Activity 1. Am I quadratic or not? Determine whether each quadratic is a quadratic or not. The ICT integration, hardware, textbook, laptop, projector, and the software PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, for the day, 7:30 to 9, the learning competency was to solve quadratic equation by extracting square roots, factoring, calculating the square, and using the quadratic formula. So our contextualization solves the distance of a person's head from the surface of the water. For example, is y is equals to x squared minus 8x plus 7. So the discussion will be the listen and understand the following topics. First is solving quadratic equation by extracting square roots. Second is solving quadratic equation by factoring. Third is solving quadratic equation by completing the square. And last is solving quadratic equation using the quadratic formula. And for the independent practice is deeper. So they are giving to one example from any of the four topics that were discussed earlier and solve it on the paper or bond paper. So the assessment is solve me activity 2. So solve each of the following by using extracting square roots, factoring, completing the square, and using quadratic formula. Lastly is the ICT integration. So we have hardware and software. We use hardware like textbook, laptop, or projector. And then the software will be the PowerPoint presentation.
For Wednesday, same times, 7:30 to 9, the learning competency is the characterize the roots of the quadratic equation using the discriminant. Then contextualization, characterizing and describing the roots of a quadratic equation using discriminant. So, then for discussion, listen and understand the following, following topics. Characterize, characteri, characteristic of the roots of a quadratic equation using discriminant. Then for independent practice, practice C, complete the table. Given a quadratic equation, complete the table. Then for assessment, activity 4, complete me. Give a quadratic equation, complete the table and describe the roots of the quadratic equation. Then for ICT integration, we have hardware, the textbook, laptop, and projector. For software, we have PowerPoint presentation.
And for Thursdays, same time, the learning competencies will be to describe the relationship between the coefficients and the roots of a quadratic equation. The contextualization, bring any kinds of frames and find the dimensions of the frame. And for the learning task, discussion, listen and understand the following topics: relation of roots and the sum and the product of the roots. And for the independent practice, practice D, find my roots. Find the roots of the following quadratic equation using any of the method: extracting square roots, factoring, completing the square, and using the quadratic formula. And for the assessment, activity 6, are we related? Given an equation and complete the table. And for the ICT integration, for hardware, we have textbook, laptop, and projector. And for the software, we have video presentation and PowerPoint presentation. Jofi. Jofi. No.
Okay, for the fifth day, Friday, time 7:30 to 9 a.m. Learning competency. Solves equations transferable to quadratic equations, including rational algebraic equations. Solving transformable in quadratic equations, including rational algebraic equations. Learning task. Listen and understand the following task 8. Equations transformable to quadratic equations, including rational algebraic equations. Independent practice. Practice E. Solve and match. And for the assessment, activity number 7, solve me. Solve the following real-life situations that involves equations transformable to quadratic equations. And for the ICT tools for hardware, laptop and projector. And for the software, PowerPoint presentation.
So for our part two, day and time, the same Monday, 7:30 to 9. So our learning competency is to illustrate quadratic equations. So for our specific daily learning outcomes, so through the illustration of quadratic equation, the student will be able to first write a quadratic equation in standard form and identify the values of A, B, and C in a standard form quadratic equation. So for and second, use the quadratic formula to find all real solutions. So for our daily procedures, we will start our class with a prayer and then state the topic to be discussed and objectives as well. So present the PowerPoint, discuss and illustrate quadratic equation, then ask questions about the discussion and give a short quiz, and then lastly, 5 minutes before the class ends, I will let the students pass their output. So that would be in Monday. So the second day we have Tuesday, the same time as well. So the learning competency is to solve quadratic equation by first extracting square roots, second is factoring, third is completing the square, and the last one is using the quadratic formula. So for the specific daily learning outcomes, through the concept of solving quadratic equation, the students will be able to first is to identify different method in solving quadratic equation. And the second one is to solve quadratic equations by extracting square roots, factoring, completing the square, and using the quadratic formula. So for our daily procedures, first, of course, we will still start the class with a prayer and then state the topic to be discussed in the session's objectives. And the teacher will ask a question about the what the students learned from the topic. The teacher will present the lesson objectives, then proceed with the discussion. So the discussion flow is solving quadratic equation by extracting square roots, solving quadratic equation by factoring, solving quadratic equations by completing the square, and solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. So, and then lastly, ask students to give an example from four topics that have been discussed and solve it on the paper or board. Give a short quiz, solve each of the following number. So if we still have a time. So lastly, 5 minutes before the class ends, the students pass their output. And that would be all for Monday and Tuesday.
For Wednesday, the characterize the roots of a quadratic equation using discriminant is the learning competency. Then for specific daily outcomes is the student must able to characterize the roots of quadratic equation using discriminant like and describe the roots of the quadratic equation. Then for daily procedure, start the class with a prayer, then state the topic to be discussed and session's objective, play a 3-minute video using projector, then discuss the characteristic of the quadratic equation using discriminant, then give example and give some quadratic equation and let the class solve and ask someone to solve in the board and check the answer individually. Then give a short practice activity. After that, give a short quiz, which is complete the table and describe the roots of quadratic equation. So before 3 minutes, it will end. So collect the paper of the student.
So in Thursday, learning competency describe the relationship between the coefficients and the roots of a quadratic equation. A contextualization through the concept of quadratic equation, the students will be able to A. Recognize the relationship between the roots of a quadratic equation and its coefficients. B. Identify the sum and products of the roots using the formula B over A and C over A respectively for a quadratic equation. C. Form a quadratic equation given its roots including when the roots are integrates, rational number, real number, and complex number, and solve related problems. To start the class with a short prayer. Second is play a motivational video. Next, ask someone to share their takeaways from the video presented. Fourth, start the discussion proper. Ask someone to recall the previous lesson. Fifth, discuss the roots and coefficients of the quadratic equation using the prepared PowerPoint presentation. Sixth, ask for volunteers to find the roots of the given example of the quadratic equation in the board. Seven, let the other students answer by their own paper and check it by themselves. 8. Give another example for quadratic equation. 9. Let the students define the sum and the roots of the quadratic equation. 10. Give the students a seat work and complete the table. And lastly, 5 minutes before the class ends, let the students pass their output.
Friday.
Friday, 7:30. Competency. Solve the equations transferable to quadratic equations, including rational algebraic equation. Through the concept of quadratic equation, the students will be able to A. Determine an equation that is transformable to quadratic equation. B. Solve equations transformable to quadratic equations, including rational algebraic equations. Daily procedure. First, we will start with an introduction of lesson that will be discussed. Next is discuss equations that can be transformed to quadratic equation, followed by trying some examples that explains equations that can be transformed into quadratic equation. Next, give some examples some students can try on the board. Next, give all students individual practice, matching column A to column B. Next will be students will answer a quiz of solving equations, transformable quadratic equations, including rational algebraic equations. And lastly, papers will be collected before the class is dismissed.
And that would be our report. Thank you and God bless.